All right, these are excerpts from going back, and one of them I can't remember, but the other day when we finished filming, I have no idea whether I read this or not. I talked about Lula Bell and Scotty Wiseman a little bit, and Lula Bell was featured in a book called Women in Country Music or something like that. And it's a wonderful book that would give you a little bit of insight into her effect on show business itself, especially with Gracie Allen and the George Burns and Gracie Allen show that was done. But one of the things that I had meant to say in the deal and kind of sped on through was how the entertainers on the WLS Barn Dance got to be paid. Now, there were some interesting things about, you used to have those old barn dances. You had the Grand Ole Opry, obviously, in Nashville, Tennessee, and you had the WLS Barn Dance. Eventually, you had a Louisiana hayride out of Shreveport, Louisiana. You had the Old Dominion Barn Dance out of Richmond, and you had the WWVA Jamboree out of Wheeling. Those were the major outlets for country music or anything of that nature back in those days. Precedent was that all these cats when radio came along and everything, they found out that was the best marketing tool that they could possibly get, you know, whether it was Bill Monroe or any of the other guys. And they would go out and most of them didn't, if they had a sponsor for their radio program, basically the sponsor paid the radio station to carry them. It was, as I said, it was a marketing device. I know even carrying over into the 60s with the deal that Reno and Smiley cut up here, I think that with Carlton Haney, when he was getting them sponsorship out of Kroger and some of the other folks in the area up here. I think Dr. Pepper was one of the sponsors. That basically the sponsorship paid for the band. The money that the guys made that owned the band was on their weekends when they were able to go out. But anyhow, most of those early radio programs were just a marketing tool. And people would work their radio show in the morning and say they were going to be out at some local school or something that evening or something, and it was just a way of promoting that. And everybody's just glad to be able to get on that radio for nothing, kind of like the way they jump up on stage over at Floyd, Virginia these days. Just happy to be there. Anyhow, radio stations used to be, or these programmers weren't very prompt on their payment to their artists. So I don't know whether I read it in that Women in Country Music book or wherever it came from, but an old story that I can't verify is that the performers on the WLS Barn Dance were not being paid. Al Capone had a girlfriend that wound up going over and getting herself a guest spot on the WLS Barn Dance. And without his knowledge or anything, she goes and does the show and comes back the next week telling Al as to how she's been on the radio on the Barn Dance, and his immediate response was, "How much did you get paid?" And she said, "Nothing, the performers don't get paid." And within a couple of months, that situation got rectified. So it was just a curiosity there. It's always been a curiosity to me, you know, the gravitation of all this music, and whether it be jazz music, and if you've read very much about Louis Armstrong, some of the binds that he got himself into, especially after an altercation with the law out in California early on in his movie career, and wound up having two of those guys in Chicago at odds over him, and Louis' answer was to head to Europe and stay there for a couple of years till the heat came off. So I thought that was kind of neat. Anyhow, that's one thing I'd forgotten about, how the folks up there. I also don't know, I did mention, I think, and somebody nodded to me if this is the case, about how the difference in the Grand Ole Opry, where they just brought somebody out and set them down in front of a mic, and the WLS Barn Dance, where it was actually a show. When Lula Bell would do her entrance for instance. She'd come in from the back of the auditorium. She was looking for her man, wherever he had come from, and eventually she'd work her way through the audience. You know, it was 3 to 5 minutes before she'd get to the stage, and at that point, Scotty would make his entrance and they would start their act up there. That makes it extremely difficult for radio. When you've got 2 or 3 minutes of your act happening out in the audience there and not off of it. So I think that's one of the things that led, had the barn dance been televised, you know, the Opry they tried a couple of times in the 50s, but they never did make the effective transition of the Grand Ole Opry, doing from that walk out there and sing your song and go away. That wasn't attractive to television. They tried it a couple of times in the 50s and it didn't work out. So anyhow, here I got us up to 1945, and we're talking about Lester Flatt, and we're also talking about 1945. And it's sort of, we finally made our way to the end of the Great Depression. It took a World War to do it and all the rest of the stuff, but after we got shot out over in Hawaii and jumped into the fray ourselves, full tilt on both sides of the world, it was a terrible time. My father was part of that affair. He was shot down. He was a tail gunner in a B-24 Liberator, shot down over Stuttgart, Germany. And I may talk a little bit about it after a while, or I may forget, but it's real funny. About a year before my father passed away, he and Paul Warren were sitting around a campfire at Bean Blossom, Indiana, talking about their various experiences, and they'd both been POWs, and they'd both been in a prison camp in Stuttgart, Germany. Both had been members of little bands that they had, and neither was aware of the other's presence there. There was something like 15,000 men in that one particular encampment that they had. But anyhow, and it's real funny, the different effect. I was able to speak to Paul's son, Johnny, for a little bit, and he indicated that he was nearly a grown man before he had even known his father had been to war, whereas it was something that was part of the terror in my household of hearing my father up in the middle of the night screaming and running through the house. It was just different the way those guys handled that whole deal. Anyhow, 1945, and there's excitement happening here, and there's also some excitement happening on the Grand Ole Opry because Jim Shoemate brought this banjo player into Bill Monroe's dressing room over at the Grand Ole Opry. Bill had stood the fella up a couple of times for auditions, and he finally walks in, and I think I talked about this a little bit in the earlier video, but Earl comes into Bill Monroe's dressing room and plays a tune or two, and Bill turns around to Lester and says, "What do you think?" And Lester says, "Well, he can keep up with us." And that's where I may have made the white shirt comment a little bit previously. But it was right toward the end of the year when this happened. Now, when Earl first performed with Bill after their estrangement of some time, one of the stories that Bill told was the first Christmas, soon after Earl was hired in the band, very soon, it came to be Christmas and most of the other guys in the band went home. And Earl and Bill played the Grand Ole Opry, and that was Christmas, I think, for them. And they spoke of it in such a manner that you knew that that moment there had a lot of effect on both of their lives. Anyhow, here's another tune that we're going to put out. Earl showed up in town, and we've got this sound, this wall of sound coming at you that hasn't been identified as bluegrass music yet. You know, Bill hasn't made himself one of the most likable characters at the Grand Ole Opry. And I think I've talked a little bit about that in the past, have I not, about folks making on noise while he was on stage doing a gospel show, and then him threatening to whip the whole stage that was doing that. All that, well, that's one thing. Let's play this Mighty Dark to Travel, and I'll get you a little bit further caught up with that.
It's mighty dark for me to travel, for my sweetheart she is
Anyhow, I was going to talk about this thing about bluegrass music coming about and what it was. But before I get there, see, you done got these two sounds in your head of the high speed of what they did. I want to play you something else right now to come along that will show you the greatest bluegrass quartet of all. That's the one that had Bill Monroe singing the tenor and Earl Scruggs singing the baritone part. And Earl Scruggs' baritone part is unmatched. We've had wonderful baritone singers in bluegrass music. Sonny Osborne, Eddie Adcock are two that come to mind as just being wonderful singers. But as far as where Earl placed the baritone singing in the music that came to be called bluegrass, it can't be done any better. The way the parts switch when your lead man drops his part and the tenor jumps up and catches an alto and the baritone has to come over the top of that for to assume in posture a tenor role there for a second to cover that. Earl was an absolute master. The dynamic, "Oh Lord, I'm traveling on." Listen to that happen here. Here's one of their songs, "Traveling On and On."
I heard Jesus calling, saying, "Come unto me." Now I'm traveling on and on. Oh Lord, I'm traveling on by the help of my Savior. I can never astray, for Jesus leads the way.
Now, if you enjoyed that, they had "Shine, Hallelujah, Shine." They had "Little Community Church." They had "He Will Set Your Fields on Fire," and they were all magnificent, everything they did there. I'd spoke to you a few minutes ago and wanted to get some of the music back to back so you could start hearing the sound of this music that was completely different than any of that stuff that we played early on, that even the Monroe Brothers stuff. There was something about this stuff that a Grand Ole Opry announcer said, "Here's Bill Monroe playing you some of that good bluegrass music from up in Kentucky." It was a separator. And that's a point that I'm going to try to make right now. When the music got named as bluegrass, it was a separator. It separated from Monroe from the remainder of the country music that was being played off of the stage of the Grand Ole Opry. Most of these folks at the Grand Ole Opry at this point were just Middle Tennessee country folks that come down there, whether it be the Fruit Jar Drinkers, Uncle Jimmy Thompson, Uncle Dave Macon. All these guys, they come in from as far away as Knoxville over there, but it was sort of a Tennessee, southern country music deal there. But all of a sudden, here comes that guy from down in Kentucky, and he's playing in keys that nobody else don't play in. And he's playing at tempos that these folks were losing their breath listening to. And he's singing higher than anybody that they ever heard in the world. And there was resentment in that. He was different. And a lot of the guys like Sam and Kurt McGee took issue with him in public as not being of the same stock that they were in his doing. An incident I told you about earlier on, alluded to. And on the Grand Ole Opry, when somebody would be singing a sad song, somebody like Oswald would be over at the other side of the stage and, just howl out like he's in uncontrollable misery because of this song that this guy's singing or something else. There was always some kind of playfulness going on, especially around the Acuff group in those days. This wasn't with the Acuff group. I don't know, it was one of the Square Dance bunch, but Monroe was singing a gospel song and there was a commotion on the stage, and as soon as he finished the song, he went over and identified one of the sources of that commotion, promptly lifted him by his lapels up against a wall and said if anybody made a sound on that stage while he was doing a gospel song in the future, he was going to clean the stage up with them. Now, those are the kind of things that don't endear you to your fellow cast members. Monroe was not, a part of that camaraderie of what we normally associated with the Grand Ole Opry in those days. And that word bluegrass to describe his music was only a further reinforcement of that separation, that he's not like us. His music's not like us. Now, with that being said, he comes along and he happens into himself his first hit record. And here will be. Here's your Blue Moon of Kentucky.
Blue moon of Kentucky, keep on shining.
Okay, band's in high gear now. They're out working big show dates. Monroe's adding to his show. You know, eventually his show's going to include a circus tent. He'll have acts like the Everly Brothers for his front acts when he's going on in the tank. Carries him a baseball team on the road. A lot of the members of his band were hired because of their athletic ability. String Bean was, from what I understand, a great baseball pitcher. And Bill, because of his vision, the problems that I mentioned early on in this presentation, was unable to excel at baseball. His vision just prohibited him from being able to hit or throw a ball. But I will speak with you later about an episode in 1967 where he could still throw a ball hard enough to let me know he was still alive. Anyhow, baseball teams there, they go out and play in the afternoon with some local baseball teams. That's drumming up for the crowd that night and all of that. Big country music show happening, and it's exciting. Here's Monroe between 35 and 40 years old. He's starting to make money hand over fist. And like all the other country music acts, and the lament of the sideman, didn't really pay folks a lot for working for him. But neither did anybody else back in those days. Back in those days, a job with a nationally or a big-time touring act was your stepping stone into your own show business career. The same way Jack Green or Cal Smith or some of the guys that came out of Ernest Tubbs' band were able to parlay their time as a sideman into a career for themselves. Out of Monroe's band, Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs, Jimmy Martin, Carter Stanley, just on and on and on with names that I'll be mentioning as this thing gathers steam here in a little while. Anyhow, big time show, and it's moving. All kinds of other changes too. We start getting recording enhancements. We're going to soon make the transition from the time they just stuck a needle down on a piece of acetate and made your record to where we're getting into the point of multi-track recording, digital effects. Here's you a neat one right here, and it's one of the classic sounds of the banjo. Back in the days when this record was done, one of the outlets you had for your music was truck stops and jukeboxes in truck stops and restaurants. Here's one of the first recordings that came along that sounded like it had electronic enhancement done to the banjo.
Run, old Molly, run, run, old Molly, run. Tin Brook's gonna beat you to the...
All right, there you have Molly and Ten Brooks. That's it. That was the sound, and it was exciting, and that tenor voice, it was a perfect vehicle for Earl's music, or Earl's banjo playing, and Earl's banjo playing was a perfect complement. The music came together. Earl had a sense of timing and pace that was immaculate. You could see it all the way through his time with the Monroe band, and then his time in the Flatt and Scruggs band later on. He was the anchor. They talk about timing in bluegrass music, and most of that comes from Earl Scruggs and Bill Monroe. The timing. I'm going to jump way out of character here in context, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit what bluegrass people call timing. It's an issue of three facets. It actually has the facet of tempo or pace, which is the simple dead click of a clock. It has a rhythm to it, which is a biomechanical movement. When that biomechanical movement is exercised, whether it's strumming, plucking, or bowing a note, when that biomechanical movement is exercised in a repetitive manner, it gives a feeling of motion in the music. Then the thing of timing. Timing's like a golf swing. You know, if you look at music like a golf swing, you look at your pace being the 1,001 of the backswing, 1,002 of the swing through. That's your tempo. The rhythm of it is simply that biomechanical movement through which you execute that, all those moving parts. With the guitar, it has to do with pushing a pick up and down. With finger picks, it's playing like that. You know, with a fiddle, you got your bow, that biomechanical movement. The timing is your release point. In that golf club, if you don't release that club soon enough, you're supposed to have a straight line twixt your shoulder all the way down to the golf ball through that club hand. If you don't release it soon enough, you're going to be behind it. The ball's going to go to the right. If you release too early, the club's going to get out in front of everything. It has the same to do with music. But there's a little bit further stretch in that when you get to where these folks in bluegrass played. David Greer one time told me it was like imagining a flat car, 5 flat cars on a railroad. And theoretically, every musician is right in the middle of his flat car. What does it change the speed of the train if the musician's playing the lead runs up to the front of his flat car to play his note? Now, if that puts him 5 or 10 milliseconds in front of the beat, as long as he maintains that consistency, he may come out Earl Scruggs, because you want to listen to Foggy Mountain Banjo, you'll hear a whole lot of that, 5 to 10 milliseconds in front of a beat. That depends on the rhythm section being able to hold back on it and not going with him. In the case of Bill Monroe's music, the music played all over the beat. The rhythm of a tune defined that tune as much as its unique melody. The rhythm and tempo defined that tune as much as the key that it played in, or its own particular set of lyrics if it were a song. But I'll be getting back to this in the 70s when Monroe's music has gotten much more sophisticated and we're out of this primal form that I'm trying to show you and describe right now. Just one more little sour note in everything that Uncle Butchie's got to throw in everything, and I hope a lot of people don't see this. You boys cut it out if you want to. But just for history's sake, and that which can only get there if somebody visits Radford University, for those people who want to give Earl Scruggs equal credit with Bill Monroe for the creation of bluegrass music, here's what Earl sounded like when he was beginning his career with Monroe. I played you a version of Bill at age 25 playing Long Journey Home at a considerable pace. Here's one of the more popular instrumentals that Bill carried with his show all down through time. And every banjo player that ever played with him had a version of this or not to play. My particular favorite was Lamar Greer's. He had some interesting takes on it. But here's your tune called the Bluegrass Breakdown. And at the end, enough said. Flatt and Scruggs Band sort of goes all the way of all things in the 48, 49 range, depending on who you believe. Lester Flatt walked out of the band first. He had it when you see any of those. Evidently, Lester was a bit of a temperamental sort of fellow. A lot of their early on publicity photos, or some of the photos I've seen, generally the band would all be in a pile and Lester would be off over on the side just a little bit with a not too happy look on his face. So I don't know what the personal dynamic was. I had a few interactions with Lester. My only thing was to go once upon a time, and both Dave Freeman and Ken Irwin had expressed interest in a Paul Warren fiddle record. Paul had developed cirrhosis. I went up to ask him if he wanted to do a record. He said that'd be fine, but Lester had to approve it. And when I went to Lester, he said it would be a fine. Paul could make that record, but were he to do it, he would be fired as part of the Nashville Grass. So Lester put the quietus on that, and after 25 years of service, I think Paul may have drawn $150 for his last week of work. Enough said. Anyhow, Lester left first. According to Bill, Lester came back a couple of weeks later and asking for his job back. According to Lester or Gladys one, Bill was at their door after a couple of weeks banging on the door asking Lester to come back. It didn't happen. I don't know how Monroe was back in those days, but it didn't matter who it was when I worked for him. As long as he had his voice and his mandolin, and there was some pedestal that he could stand on that put him a step or two higher than the audience. I've shown up at bluegrass festivals with him when there wouldn't be nothing but a flatbed truck in a field. And that was fine for him. If he had his mandolin and his voice, he'd climb up on that bed of that truck or that trailer and do his deal. Like I said, I don't know how it was back in those days. I don't know how he looked at his stuff. The stories that I got, I'm going to be explaining how they changed drastically in the 60s. But anyhow, it wasn't long after Lester quit that Earl quit, and Earl supposedly went back to North Carolina, but within a relatively small period of time, Lester had gone to North Carolina and the Foggy Mountain Boys were born. I recall Hubert Davis talking to me one time about sitting on the porch when they were having their first rehearsal session as Lester Flatt, Earl Scruggs, and the Foggy Mountain Boys, and that was a wonderfully exciting thing for him. Anyhow, the band's gone, but ain't no horse stops Monroe show. He's still a Grand Ole Opry star, and he's going at it as hard as he can. He winds up with a fellow named Mac Wiseman singing for him. Brings in a banjo player that he had auditioned before Earl, but that banjo player had gone into the military and during the Second World War, and Earl Scruggs wound up with the job. But Don Reno came in right after Earl, and he had a guitar player and singer there called Mac Wiseman, or named Mac Wiseman. He was up from the Shenandoah Valley here in Virginia, and they did a couple of songs, Traveling Down This Lonesome Road and Sweetheart of Mine, Can't You Hear Me Calling? And they were two classics, and the band didn't last nearly long enough. I heard Monroe say on many occasions that he loved singing with Mac Wiseman because Mac was so strong that he could sing again. And when we start talking about timing and stuff, when I get into some of the 70s music, the way it changed when it became an elevated art form, that's a very significant thing of learning how to play against something else. That's a very significant thing in that music that they called bluegrass. But anyhow, it wasn't long after Mac come along that stepson of a preacher from over in Sneedville, Tennessee, comes to town. And you had born the Frog Martin. He gets him a job with Jimmy Martin, or Jimmy Martin gets him a job with Bill Monroe, and off they go. They used to say that Martin, when they were doing Uncle Pen, would stand over against the walls of the radio station everywhere else, just playing that G run till he had driven everybody crazy with it. It's kind of like most banjo players' tuning. They can drive you crazy real quick. But anyhow, here's one of Bill's more popular tunes through the years. It was recorded with the Jimmy Martin Band. Here's your tune called Uncle Pen.
Break up day when the caller hollered, do-si-do, you knew Uncle Pen was ready to go. Late in the evening about sundown, high on the hill above the town, Uncle Pen played the fiddle, Lord, how it would ring. You could hear it talk, you could hear it sing.
Uncle Pen. Late in the evening about sundown, high on the hill and above the town. I never will forget when Bill Monroe, when Randy Davis quit the band, Bill come to me and told me I was going to have to start singing baritone in the Bluegrass Boys. And that was a challenge because I'm not a great vocalist by any stretch of the imagination. Anyhow, I never will forget the first time we sang Uncle Pen on the stage. Monroe acted like, when he heard me singing the part with him, it was much as if he had just taken a bite into the sourest Granny Smith apple that you've ever seen. I just got this look out of him like that. It's real curious. Later on, in later years, in the 90s, I had taken him up to Rosine when they dedicated a plaque on the side of a barn to him up there. So they've got all these folks inside that barn, and they've got their little jamboree going, and they get Bill up, and they got a guitar player there with him, but the guitar player in that particular band didn't sing or anything. And I was playing the banjo with him. I had some guy's banjo part, I think, and he asked me if I would sing the lead to Uncle Pen for him. And I said, well, Mr. Bill, I always sang baritone. Your trio, I don't know whether I can even find the lead or not. He said, well, I'll catch the, no, I ain't gonna do that now. He said, well, I'll catch the verses, and said, you do the lead on the chorus. So I said, okay, and I saw the same look, the same sour Granny Smith look. As soon as I started the lead, I got it out of both the lead and the baritone part with him in through time. But so far, when we've been talking about Monroe and his development, and right now I'm talking well within the confines of what I call the primal form of bluegrass music. There wasn't a whole lot of attention paid to instrumentals. They had a few to show off the flashy banjo playing of Earl, but here's of the primal form mandolin tunes that came out, here's the Holy Grail. This is the one he has developed. Earl's been gone for the band long enough now that his chop has developed, that all the timing, the rhythm, the pacing of that band is all based on his mandolin chop now. James told me years ago that when Bill would go out and do his chores of a morning, that he'd come back in and sit at the foot of the bed and just sit there and chop rhythm on his mandolin and move his feet to it if he were dancing, as if he were dancing. Now, I know for a fact he had a tremendous knowledge of rhythmic form, and I may have spoken about this. I can't remember. I've talked about this stuff so much I can't remember what we've actually got on the video or not. But he would talk about what there was to playing a march. And then I think he was explaining we had been playing under the double eagle or McKinley's march and showing how you go from that march form into a simple two-beat form. It was after that, but he had a knowledge of those things. Whether you were playing a three-quarter time, if you were playing it to sound like a waltz or a minuet, where it's got to be a bit more delicate. He knew the nuances of that stuff. And by knowing that enabled this music that came to be called bluegrass to become a magnificent fusion. I tried to explain earlier how Lester Flatt, it's obvious listening to him, that he hadn't listened to Uncle Dave Macon sing a lot, or Roy Acuff sing a lot. When you listen to him, you probably convinced as I am that he listened a whole hell of a lot more to Bing Crosby than he did to anybody else. The timing, the feel of Earl when he came in that band was more a bebop feel that was integrated into this thing. I talked earlier in the presentation about the chop of the black jazz music out of Chicago that came into it. And then how you hear Monroe's choppiness in his playing. You can hear that cryptic intro to Mule Skinner Blues, how everything is choppy and it beats and it's hard. It's hard and it's fast. By the time this instrumental right here is done, his playing, the downstrokes have developed for his melody lines. He's still got that tremolo. But he's like Earl, they've also got instruments that are hard as hell to play. They've tuned them up so high. Benny Martin said when he was in Monroe's band, he couldn't keep the neck in a fiddle because they tuned to Monroe's voice. They didn't tune to a tuning fork or a pitch pipe. Bill come out and sang a couple of notes of a song. that song's supposed to be in the key of G, so everybody tuned to that, you know. And most of the time they wound up to being a fret to, or a half step to 2 half steps sharp by doing that. And here, as I said, here's sort of the holy grail of those primal form mandolin tunes. Here's Rawhide. And I was talking to you about them flying. They had this tent show they go out and do. They're traveling around now. We're going to be showing pictures. The mode of transportation's upgraded. We should have a couple of shots in here we do of them getting on an airplane, and most especially the shots of them beside an old stretch limousine they used to travel in. He used to use those. But the amounts of money that they were making were staggering for those days. I heard, my dad told me about being at a show that he had gone to over in Richlands at the old Doran Airport that they'd put on for Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys back in that era. And I think I just had cake crumbs on my mouth. And that close-up right there will be good for that. But anyhow, they had played at the Doran Airport, and I think the admission had been something like 50 cents and a quarter a head or something like that. My dad had been at the show. He said it was the largest crowd that he had ever seen at that point. And I think Monroe remembered the show, and it was a 60-40 split with the promoter, and he took home over $8,000. Now that's pretty good money for those days, you know, for an entertainer going out. You know, part of the thing was Earl was the only guy in the band with a high school education back in them days, and he got to count all the money and take care of it. It's interesting, I heard Bill Keith telling about the first time that Earl set up a checking account for Bill Monroe. Bill Monroe gave Earl this shopping bag, grocery bag full of money. They'd been talking to him about getting a bank account set up and everything, so he heads down to the bank and sets up a bank account for Bill Monroe, and he comes back. He's got him a savings account started and a regular checking account, and he explains to Bill that here's his savings account book and here's his checkbook. If he wants anything, he can just write a check for it rather than having to pay cash. So Bill takes us, oh, thank you, and goes on their merry way. And about 2-3 weeks later, Bill comes to Earl and hands him another grocery bag and says, go down to the bank and get me some of my money. I'm needing a little bit of cash. I mean, that was his concept of how all that stuff worked. That's going to play really important when we get toward the end of his days, and also toward the end of the 50s when we get there. But anyhow, all right, there were a lot of changes happening in Monroe's music. It had been experimental in the beginning. It wasn't too far of a stretch to, you know, when you got Sally Forrester coming in with an accordion. Bill's mother played an accordion, so he was familiar with that sound. But all this sort of came together in that classic ensemble in 45, 46, 47, 48. The recordings were made. The celebrity was developed across the board. You know, it was a great thing for Earl Scruggs. It was announced a lot of times the Bluegrass Boys were introduced off of the Grand Ole Opry as here's Bill Monroe with Earl Scruggs and his fancy banjo coming in. And at that time, it wasn't really the fancy banjo, except maybe for that mother toilet seat resonator and I forget what they call those, RB11s or something. Maybe it had the perloid. I'm not a connoisseur of antique banjos, so I don't really know all that much. All I know is I got one over here. So anyhow, we're up to the early 50s. There's been experimentation going on, but this sound has sort of settled itself in for 5 or 6 or 7 years. And rock and roll ain't quite come along yet. I mean, it's just out there. This guy's got him a career and he's going along and he's still searching for more and more. And he went in the studio with a fellow named Harold Bradley. And that classic ensemble that he happened upon that when he found it, he never was going to change it. Right here, we might hear a bit of a deviation.
Yodelay, olay, olay. Moon, moon, I can see you smiling low. You made me think of a sweetheart, a little.
And here's still even more of the deviation.
Bendy Dubé was a great engineer. He told his fireman, don't you ever fear.
Now, I thought these electric instruments, they had probably been in response to the electric instruments that were coming into the Grand Ole Opry. When I first heard these recordings, you know, that the Bradleys had put together that had the electric guitars, I think it was Grady Martin playing on that, and had, which one, Owen Bradley maybe is the one that played the keyboard, Owen or Harold one, anyhow, one of those guys. But anyhow, there was experimentation with the sound. It wasn't quite as solidly set by that time as Monroe indicated later on in the 60s, that once he had found what he was looking for. Now I'm going to insert something right here, another one of them ugly little butchy things. I'm going to talk to you about two bands right now, and one of them is going to be a 70s band, and the other one's the Bill Monroe band. It's often indicated that these band leaders came along with some conceptual idea that they had of a sound, and they tried to put that together. My question is, did Bill Monroe solicit Earl Scruggs to cap his musical monument? Did J.D. Crowe solicit Ricky Skaggs or Tony Rice or Jerry Douglas for that sound that he was trying to create? Because he did create a wonderful sound. It was the most definable sound this side of 1970 that came along, that called itself bluegrass. You know, there were other definable sounds, but by then they were coining new terms like newgrass and something like that. You know, these guys became stars or had their own band in such a posture that they could afford to have a band. It was a job. Chubby Wise heard that Howdy Forrester was going into the military, so he came to get that job, and Bill Monroe wound up with the sound of Southern blues fiddling, where they had been hoedown fiddlers before that and breakdown fiddlers, but all of a sudden here he's got a fiddler that can play the blues with him. It was a job, and a young aspiring musician goes to that job. The same way Jerry Douglas did when he came down from Ohio, Ricky Skaggs did after he had gone over to D.C. and played around with the Seldom Scene and all them fellers, and goes back into Kentucky over there. Tony Rice over here in Louisville, he's working for a band where he's making $100 a week or less, and Lonnie Pierce is subsidizing him all the way, and all of a sudden J.D. offers him a job 90 miles east, paying a good salary, and he's got a place to live in the process. It was just jobs. This music, the funny thing about all the great bands, it seems like they just sort of came together. It was just sort of a magic that brought them there, and most of that magic being one guy that got himself in a position where he could write a check. Amazing. Anyhow, I'm going to get back to the mid-50s or early 50s right now, and I'm going to go back to the Jimmy Martin band because it was classic. With Jimmy Martin, Rudy Lyle was the banjo player. He had come from down somewhere in Southside Virginia, I think. But Bill Monroe first heard him on Mount Airy down at WPAQ and offered him a job, and sooner or later he took it. Wonderful, wonderful banjo player. To me, he did not have the timing and pace of an Earl, but what he did have was a feel for a bluesier side of bluegrass music. The break that he took on Rawhide that we just heard a while ago, There was a real unique cut of Sugar Coated Love that was done while Carter Stanley was in the band for a little while. White House Blues, which is a classic. He just had a lick on the banjo that was extremely complimentary of this music without being a foundational cornerstone. Anyhow, here's probably it's either my favorite or second favorite trio. With the Flatt and Scruggs Monroe sound, it had to do with the quartet. But as far as the trio is concerned, where Charlie Klein and Jimmy Martin switched the parts in this, wow. Here's a wonderful song, I Hear a Voice Calling.
I hear a voice calling. It must be our Lord. It's coming from heaven on high.
Now it's in the 50s and we didn't hear a whole lot about this until later on after Ralph Rensler is going to get a hold of Bill's career. But Bill was writing instrumentals at this point. Now here's an instrumental that's been covered by Ricky Skaggs, who got a Grammy off of it, and some other folks out there. This is called Wheelhouse. Again, I would ask you to listen to the feel of this tune. It's not Wheelhouse Breakdown. It's got power to it. Listen to the banjo player play a third part that never was played. Now, nobody else ever played it. I've never heard it except on this recording or when I've done it just to confuse people. Here's a tune called Wheelhouse, and it's supposed to be significant of the power of a locomotive. Here's another tune that Bill wrote along a theme. This one's called Cheyenne. And another tune that Bill wrote in this part, and he says he wrote this while String Bean was in the band, or he said that he wrote this while String Bean was in the band. But they were playing in Roanoke, Virginia at the American Theater up there. And I think that was the theater. I remember seeing Flatt and Scruggs up there one time. But anyhow, supposedly that's where this tune, Roanoke, came from. Now, rock and roll music is starting to make a little bit of a splatter. Down in Memphis, Tennessee, this guy Sam Phillips had a record label down there. You could pretty much walk in off the street and make yourself a record. And this young fella that, I remember we were living over in East Tennessee when all this stuff broke. We were over around Rogersville, and the local DJ there said, "We've got a record by an up-and-coming young fella from down in Memphis here. Here's Elvis Presley," to do whatever it was he did, and it was Elvis Presley. Here's Elvis Presley. And here's his cover. It was one of the first couple of songs that he did, but this will start to show you that Monroe's sound and his attitude about music was starting to have some far-reaching implications.
Blue moon, blue moon, blue moon, keep shining bright. Blue moon, keep on shining bright. You're gonna bring me back, my baby, tonight. Blue moon, keep shining bright. I say blue moon, I can tuck it to keep on shining. Shine on.
All right, Elvis has got Blue Moon of Kentucky happening out there, along with You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog and a whole lot of other frivolous teenage dance music. Now here's Monroe coming back with his updated version of it, and it's a real curiosity in the second part to hear how on his mandolin he's emphasizing the 2 count in a 3/4 time. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and that it's another way, the rhythm again. And he's doing those little nuances and change now that are going to be. This is what separates him from all the one-trick ponies, is the rhythm.
Blue moon of Kentucky, keep on shining.
I had a fellow from Texas come into Bill Monroe's band after he had seen some magnificent talent come through early on. You had Jimmy Martin. Mac Wiseman started out that decade. Jimmy Martin. Carter Stanley came in and played for a period of time. And that was another curiosity. Bill was always very famous for his dislike of alcohol around folks. But I think it isn't a historic secret that both Carter Stanley and Hank Williams were prone to indulge. Yet Monroe found a camaraderie with both of those guys. He co-wrote songs with Hank Williams, and he had Carter in his band. And I never heard him say one uncomplimentary thing about Carter Stanley, ever. So that just seemed a curiosity to me. Everybody, or among the old folks, everybody held, the people around nowadays don't even know who Bill Monroe was for most part, but the folks who knew of his reputation knew that he was a person who was very much against alcohol intoxication anywhere around him. The band I worked in, we were all subject to imbibe at any given time. As long as you conducted yourself in such a way that you weren't an embarrassment to either the band, him, or yourself, there was never a word said about anything. You step yourself out of line one little bit while you're in that condition, and you didn't have to walk around the block to find out about it. Anyhow, getting back to the 50s, one of the guys who sort of capped off the talent that came in the 50s was from out in Texas. And he was part of a group. Again, it's much reminiscent of what happened when Lester Flatt came in the group. He was part of a group out there called the Mayfield Brothers. And most of the gospel recordings out of the 50s wound up being Mayfield Brothers arrangements that Ed went from singing tenor, which he had done in the band. He backed himself down to the lead singer. Bill took over the tenor part. Ed plays thumb, finger pick guitar, rhythm. And it's like I said, most of those traveling on, not traveling on and on, but Precious Jesus, Hold My Hand, I Found a Hiding Place, all of that, those were right down the line, Mayfield Brothers arrangements. But, you know, the popular audience out there got to hear them. Monroe was on Decca at that point, and those were the ones that more people heard than not. Here's one of the songs that Ed and Bill split the lead singing duties on. One sings the one verse, each of them sing a verse in this song. Here's a song called I'll Meet You in the Morning.
I'll meet you in the morning, with a how do you do, and we'll sit down by the river.
Now, while Jimmy Martin's in the band, one of those sabbaticals where Rudy Lyle had to go out, he wound up getting involved in the military and during the Korean conflict. And from what I understand, I've talked to Doug Hutchins, knows a lot about Rudy and everything. I only met him a couple of times and did not have an ongoing acquaintance with him. But from what I understand, he was in a battle over there. There was a firefight, and out of 100 and some, or 100 or so men in his company, at the end of the day, there were 4 left living. And he always suffered after that from what they used to call shell shock. I think they call it post-traumatic stress syndrome nowadays. Another of the guys from back in that era was Don Reno, who was affected very much by that. He was on Guadalcanal. And I don't mean this to be humorous, and I hope to God nobody takes it out of context, but it was real funny when Don would get, back years ago when I'd be watching their TV show up here, and on Monday here'd be not Larry Richardson, what's that little guy, Larry Hall, playing the banjo in Don's place, and Don would wind up be gone for a week or so. And I understand those would be little sabbaticals he would have to take to get himself back together. Anyhow, when he'd take one of those sabbaticals, he'd come back in, he'd have about 20 or 30 new songs, and within a week or two, they'd be headed to Cincinnati up there to Sid Nathan's place to make records at King Records. I think those guys wound up recording 600 and some sides for King Records. But anyhow, I'm back to the 50s now, and Bill Monroe. One other thing I meant to bring in too is during the Jimmy Martin thing, and that's what I was talking about with Rudy. During one of the times that Rudy had to go off, Jimmy Martin brought in this 13-year-old banjo player, and they did a little bit of stuff, and that was where Sonny Osborne got his introduction to the country music business. And I would suspect that was a Lonesome Pine Fiddlers connection somehow or another. Jimmy's brother-in-law, Paul Williams, was in the Lonesome Pine Fiddlers, as was Bobby Osborne. Now, that was a band that the Kleins, I think Ezra Klein may have been the one that was ahead of that over in the edge of West Virginia. But Curly Ray Klein was in it. Charlie Klein was one of the brothers. Ezra was one of the brothers. I know Larry Richardson, a banjo player who had a song that was popular in the Fiddlers Convention circuit called Let Me Fall. And somebody did, maybe County did a record on Larry Richardson back years ago. That was one of the anchors of that. But he used to be affiliated with this fella up here in Dublin. And the guy's name was Smith somehow or another. He's a barber up there who had old banjos. John Vires has got his RB 800 now. Let me see, what else? Sonny Osborne's done come into the picture there, and we got Ed Mayfield introduced into it, and now we're going to start doing a little bit more of the talking about some of the instrumentals that happened, because we're up about the mid-50s here now. And 56, 57, rock and roll starts knocking a hell of a big hole in country music or anything that goes along to it, because it's exciting and young people are buying it. And it was an exciting time. And we got all these parents around the country that are learning about child psychology and everything. And we're cultivating that environment that we have in society today, where we have cultivated ourselves this society that promotes narcissism and rewards greed. It's got us into a wonderful place. Anyhow, here's Monroe emulating a sound of bagpipes through multiple fiddles that he was using. And his instrumental, we're going to start building on his instrumental prowess here now. Here's a tune called Scotland. For all these old boys that get to take that rocket ship ride out there and get popular and entertainer and learn to live lives where they're bigger than life and get caught up in their own publicity, a lot of times a lot of them guys take a hellacious fall on the backside. And somewhere or another in the range of 1957 somewhere in that era, Johnny Cash was getting real popular. He took Monroe out on a road trip with him to the West Coast. I think they may have done 3 nights before Monroe was dismissed and sent home because he was booed off the stage. People didn't care for that kind of music. Out on the West Coast, I don't know whether they ever did or not, but up to that point. But for sure, now that rock and roll was here, they didn't have any use for it. Kind of like folk music, which would soon make a resurgence. In the later, a couple more years in the 50s, it would start gaining some speed. Careers go to hell in a handbasket, and they go there quick when you stop selling records and stop making personal appearances. Wrote a book a few years ago, and I had it in my head that I was going to try to do a couple of them. I thought about this going into the first one. After I got done with that first one, I said, never again, Mama, never again. But the second book I wanted to write, and I actually went around and solicited a few interviews for this, is I wanted people to tell me about their experience having gone to see country music shows of the late 40s and 50s while they were still carrying a full stage act. The 2 stipulations that came to the table was, number 1, they themselves could not be musicians. They could not have played an instrument in their life. And the second stipulation was they could never have befriended a musician. What I wanted was exclusively somebody who went out and paid his money and sat down out there to watch that show. What was the entertainment value in the show that he saw? I wasn't interested in a musician giving me an analysis of what came off of that stage from a musical standpoint, nor was I interested in hearing about somebody who had a friend up there who had, if that person were a side man up there, he'd probably listen to them complain because they never did have enough money to pay their rent. You know, I didn't want any outside influence. All I wanted to know is, what did you see? It was real curious. I talked to one old fellow who saw Monroe within a week after they had recorded Uncle Pen, classic band, saw them in a theater in Baltimore, Maryland. He had real vivid memories of that show. I talked to another fellow from Beaver Dam, Kentucky, who talked about Bill coming there in 1956 to do a show. Now, in the Beaver Dam, Rosine area, Charlie was the outgoing, personable, friendly guy that everybody liked. Bill wasn't exactly, you know, as with the Grand Ole Opry, he wasn't exactly a favorite son back in those days. He was a brooding character. He was alone. He was isolated. He was the loneliest man I ever met in my life. I'd take 10 or 15 people out of his house. There'd be music going on, people dancing, everything, you know, going on around, and there's Bill sitting over in the corner of the kitchen in his little corner over there with his chair, sitting there with an electric razor shaving by himself. Just sit there. That used to be an activity. He'd do it on the bus, get his razor charged up and just sit there and shave. We're getting in the 57, 58 range right now. Monroe's going down the tubes. He filed for bankruptcy in 58. Ed Mayfield fell out on him up here. They did a show at the Dalton Theater here in Pulaski. And Ed fell out right after the show. Bill took him up on Randolph Avenue to where the old hospital was. At that point, they wouldn't take him in because he was a traveling musician. Bill wound up taking him over to Bluefield where they got him in the hospital. Bill had his 2 sons and his wife flown in, but within 4 days, Ed Mayfield was dead of acute leukemia. And he's probably, I've got 2 sources of a lot of this stuff. Most of the guys in the second half of the century, I met them to talk to them. My sources for this other stuff, a couple of them, one of them is a series of live recordings or tapes, interview tapes that Ralph Rensler did with Bill when he stepped into Bill's life. And I saw Bill Monroe break, or I heard Bill Monroe break once, and I saw him break once. I heard him break on the tape where he asks Ralph Rensler to shut the machine off so he can compose himself, and his voice was shaking at that point so much that he was in emotional distress. We had a tornado come through Bean Blossom the year after my dad died. We buried Daddy on Memorial Day down here in Russell County. And on Thursday, Daddy never would give up the idea, even to the last minute, that he was still going to be able to make one more Bean Blossom. Well, when the Bean Blossom Festival came along on Thursday, I was doing a banjo workshop, and this hellacious storm came up. I was in the old barn, and the rain was literally blowing horizontal across the barn coming in the door. There come to be an ungodly loud roar coming in, and I got everybody to run up near the stage, which was the most substantial part of the building. And as I said, it's a banjo workshop. I didn't have, 30, 40 people in there max on the thing. So we got everybody back there where the building was structurally the soundest, and this thing eventually passed us by, and it was a tornado which had hit the park. The only tornado that hit north of Bloomington that day. Bloomington's about 30 miles to the southwest from where Bean Blossom is over there. It hit and took the trees off right at tree level where my dad used to hang the Japanese lanterns to let all the Japanese folks know where his campsite was. It hit there, it bounced off the ground, it came off the ground, it went across the bottom and hit right on the about 100 yards to the back of the stage then, and just went plowing on over through. But we got out of the barn and went over there and started looking at what that done. It was like 4 o'clock, 4:30 in the afternoon. And here everybody gets together and they take out their chainsaws and their axes and their hatchets. And at 7:30 that night, that park was cleaned up enough to where the show could go on. My daddy said he just wanted to see people get together and work together and play together and have a good time. Well, he put them to working that day. And they had them a good time watching the show, and they played all night long around the campfires again, just like what he had wanted. And I told Bill that story at the end of the festival, and I saw him cry. The only time ever, the hardest man I ever met in my life, and he broke down. All right, back to showtime here. 58 and his world's collapsing. If it wasn't for some of the royalties off of Blue Moon of Kentucky and everything, he'd really had a hard time in that regular spot on the Opry over there if he needed it every Friday and Saturday night. If you look at some of his recordings that were done in the late 50s and everything, you see most of them done in the October-November range. That's when he's trying to get his folks Christmas money. That was a way of getting his musicians paid a little bit of money toward the end of Christmas. And do I want to go there? All right, here's a sound that's reflective. I might be just reading this into it, but his music's down the tubes. They got a couple of Cajuns that have made a little bit of a splatter for themselves, Rusty and Doug Kershaw at that point. And Doug is pretty prolific as a writer and everything. He's written this song called Sally Joe, and they bring him in on sessions to do this with Monroe and everything. Now, the guitar playing is a little bit loose and wild to what anything else you'll hear on a Monroe recording. But what I hear in this is that voice of Monroe. And if there's any way you can get to your volume control right now, turn this up and listen to a banshee scream. There you have it. All right, this one's called Sally Joe. There's violence. There's violence in his music at this point. I don't give a darn whether I'm just reading it into it. It's like I said, welcome to my illusion. A composite of all the events, all my life that give me my particular view of the world. It's as unique as yours. But I'm hearing something, the violence in that voice there. Listen to an instrumental here. that's got that same amount of violence in it. He's still writing his songs and naming them after geographic locations or Indian tribes or things out there, but they're the sound of something. Here's nothing but pure violence. What's going on with him psychologically right here? That was always my question. When I would get into these interviews with folks, that's what I wanted to know. What did you feel like? Here's a tune called Stony Lonesome. Monroe's down the tubes at this point. Financially, his career's pretty much just wandering around the same place that Ernie Ashworth and Talkback Trembling Lips. That celebrity thing had gone out for him. And that musical snob that he had been, when he could play faster than anybody else and plays in keys that nobody else could, all these country music bands now are coming up with their versions of hot bands. You know, Ernest Tubbs got a band out there that's following in that Texas swing tradition of Bob Wills. Ray Price is in town, the Cherokee Cowboy, and they have a tremendous, tremendous triple fiddle sound in their music. Farron Young's there. He's up from Louisiana in the Shreveport Jamboree. They're creating all these studio bands now, or the studio musicians are coming to town that are, you know, you got Hank Garland down there. He's the hottest one, the Sugarfoot Rag guy and everything. Great musicians drifting into town now and being part of that recording scene down there. And then once they've got the stuff recorded, the artists go out and get their band to learn how to do it the way the recording musicians did. That's the way it used to be done. But all these bands, and Monroe didn't have his musical high horse to be on no more. He had already run through a tremendous number of these Celtic descended Southern musicians out there. You know, with the exception of Bobby Hicks and Kenny Baker, those guys who could help him express himself as a musical artist, that pool he had to draw from was drying up fast. And it was almost like there was no bluegrass. Flat and Scruggs are out there playing. But they call themselves a country music band. Don Reno and Red Smiley out there playing, but they call themselves a country music band. The Stanley Brothers, all of them, nobody calls themselves bluegrass bands at this point. This is the end of it. It's gone here where it is. But in the Northeast, we got something happening. We've got a folk boom happening. And we got two young fellas that are involved in that. One of them named Mike Seeger and the other named Ralph Rensler, who happened upon some of them Bill Monroe records. And all of a sudden, two guys start looking at Bill Monroe as a musical artist rather than a contemporary musical celebrity. And the whole world is going to take a few years, but it's about to get ready to change for him. That's the end for today. I got one more thing that I'm going back and bring up, and this is something that may never be on the tape. And all it has to do with the Flat and Scruggs Monroe feud that was supposedly out there. I know about 2 or 3 things about this. Number one was there was supposed to be a feud because Flat and Scruggs wouldn't come work on any shows with him when they were up here. All that I know about it and where this is confusing or not, one incident. Flat and Scruggs came back to the Grand Ole Opry to visit, and Bill was performing there one night, and he asked them if they wanted to go on with him, and they said they didn't have their instruments with him. My interpretation of that is we didn't bring our instruments backstage here. We're just back here to shake and howdy and say hi to old friends. Monroe assumed that they had left their instruments at home because when he left the Grand Ole Opry and walks by the car, supposedly he saw their cases in the car. And that led to well, they just won't come back in here and play for me or play with me attitude. That's one thing I heard. From Carlton Haney, I heard. And you can check with Doug Hutchins and Fred Bartenstein on this because they both heard the same story. Carlton was hired to go to work for Bill Monroe because he was an exceptional high school athlete, baseball player and track star both. And somehow or another, Melissa Monroe, Bill's daughter, had wound up over here in Southside Virginia at Clyde Moody's house, and Carlton had met her and fallen head over heels for her. Well, he gets out of high school and somehow or another, he winds up going to work for Bill Monroe as part of his baseball team or in part of the act that he was carrying. Carlton eventually works his way into a position of road manager for Bill and doing some of the stuff, you know, working the gates and taking up money and this stuff and that stuff and seeing that road stuff gets done. Carlton says that the pressure that was brought to bear by Martha White had picked up Flatt and Scruggs as sponsors when they were around the Knoxville area over here, Knoxville, Bristol area. And they were bringing some pressure on Grand Ole Opry management to include Flatt and Scruggs in the cast. And Bill Monroe was saying, you know, it's my band. They're coming back, you know. Charlie and I couldn't get on the WLS Barn Dance because they already had a mandolin and a guitar. This is my actual band coming back here, you know. I don't want to compete with that. He passed a petition around the Grand Ole Opry and a lot of folks signed it. Now, supposedly, according to Carlton, when he was begging me not to put out what I know about what I know because I didn't hail Earl Scruggs as the god of the banjo out there, Carlton did not want me to put that book out. He made no bones about it. But I ain't never been one to pay attention to a lot of folks. Carlton says that there was a meeting at which Roy Acuff was appointed the sort of the chairman of the group, and it was a meeting of all the Grand Ole Opry stars, the cast. Management had said, you guys sort it out. The pressure's being brought on us by Martha White, but we'll go by whatever you got to say to it. Monroe goes in there and says, Roy, what happens if your band quits you, walks away from here for a year or two, and then they come back and they want to audition for the Grand Ole Opry? What if you've got Ernest Tubbs' band quits him and finds him a singer that can sing real low like that and brings that back? What are you going to do then? That's his side. That's his posture on it. According to Carlton, Flatt and Scruggs came back and says, we're going to add a dobro to our band to change the sound of it. And the other part of the agreement was made that their mandolin player, if they had one, would never take a break on the Grand Ole Opry, would never play a solo on the Grand Ole Opry. And according to Carlton, Bill walks over and looks out a window and says, well, I guess it'll be all right then. Which was something he used to say a lot when he was in agreement. I don't know. You know, Carlton was so squirrely, he'd tell me about picking up a possum skeleton and 3 days later going to Duke University to explain to all the chiropractors this new technique that he had found for popping out bones off. I don't know. I listened to Pythagoras, you know, Pythagoras coming up to the universes and ringing in the key of A to Carlton. I think the scientists say it's more like E, but, you know, Carlton had his way of understanding. Carlton did know about the sound of music, and he did know how to sell musical talent. And he's going to be a big part of the player when we bring this music back as an elevated art form, because somebody had to give it somewhere to go play where it could make some money. And Carlton did that. Boys, I think we're done for today.